Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Sakshi. I want to first thank Writers and Books and Sakshi in particular for coordinating the event, and to Peter for being willing to put up with me all these years and to interview me after the reading. So, and thank you to those of you who are here in the audience. Thanks for taking the time out. I'm gonna read. There's 3 sections in the book. I'm gonna read some poems from each section, and I'll preface some of them that might need a little context. But I'm going to start with the first poem in the manuscript, which is pretty self-explanatory, but let's just say this is like a kind of foundational poem in the sense that this is sort of, I think, how I started becoming interested in myth and poetry, and maybe even, writing myself, the idea that maybe I could create something. And it's just called A. As a boy, I loved ancient Greece and chose Sparta over Athens. What did I know of the mind then, compared to the lure of being carried home on a shield? We had 1 volume of a cheap encyclopedia, the kind you buy in a grocery store for 99 cents. Letter A. It had a picture of Achilles in bright green armor, driving his chariot. Hector's corpse, clad in scarlet and dragged behind. But as I grew older, I found I had no stomach for war. I read the Upanishads, the 4 Noble Truths, practiced TM, sought to transcend. I did not transcend. I learned to endure instead. The mind is not separate from the body, and the body is designed like a car in Detroit with planned obsolescence in mind. I was no warrior, I decided, and heeded the siren call of Athens' ruins. This next one requires a little more context. It's called Me and Question Mark. And Question Mark refers to the singer of a band from the 60s and 70s, Question Mark and the Mysterians. Some of you might know the band. Their big hit was a song called 96 Tears, which is a very catchy song. And the point of having Question Mark in the poem is that I once read in an interview with him that he said his soul originated on Mars, and that he had roamed the earth with dinosaurs. And you'll see how that figures into the poem. Me and Question Mark. When a person dies, they turn into music. My father blazed into the ether and came back as Jimi Hendrix's third stone from the sun. He's distant sounding and immediate at the same time. The swirling guitars explode like meteor dust. The riff that holds everything together reverberates. The first time I heard it, I leaned into the speakers of my cousin's stereo and felt as if someone were speaking to me. I didn't know music was made from souls then. My friend Dave left early so he could return as Nevermind the Bollocks, Here Come the Sex Pistols. He's ever present in John Lydon's rants, the rage of a generation induced by my friend's early demise. My mother slips in and out. Some days she's a person, some days she's music. She's waiting for a few friends in a small town to start a band so she can appear as the first track on their debut EP. It will be somewhat melodic. A strong, recurring hook will lead to a catchy chorus above a repeated power chord, reminiscent of the early Stooges. When I die, I plan to go to Mars. The singer from Question Mark and the Mysterians will be there. We're going to form a catchier song than 96 Tears and travel through outer space to Earth, square into the brain of a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent, and save him from a life of senseless crime. He'll learn to play the guitar, and he'll figure out the chords that are really me and Question Mark. And then, before you know it, you'll all be dancing. This next one is self-explanatory, I think. It's called Of Want and Need. In the dewdrop, a universe. I was told not to look at the sun, and it is all I have ever wanted to do. The locked door, the forbidden forest, the fragile shell. Open, walk, hold. I want only what I cannot have. But need is another story. Need speaks, and I listen. A clumsy dog of love, it enters the room, and I have no choice but to call it to me, pet the uneven fur. But what is need now that want has waned? It used to be I couldn't discern the difference. Want sings. Need speaks softly and with intent. I want to remember. I need to forget. This next one, it's brief. I made the mistake when I was a kid of asking one of my brothers to pass the salt to me. And that's all you need context-wise for this one. Salt for my brothers. When I asked you to pass the salt, I still believed there would be many tomorrows. When you asked me if my legs were broken, I thought at first you were concerned. Now I know you wanted me to be strong. It is weakness that makes us act this way. It is salt that makes the food taste good. It is salt that stings the wound. And next one is a poem about my mother's mother, who had a very bad habit of smoking her Marlboros in her bed, and just in general smoking a lot. Game of Chance. The long hallway was pitch black, like the entrance to a funhouse. Mummified in a fuchsia robe, my grandmother sat in an oversized leather chair, her robe pocked with star-shaped burns from her cigarettes. On the living room wall, a head skewered by thorns. The future kept peeking around the corner to see if I was ready. The Holy Ghost flew by with its tongue of fire like a silent bird of prey. My grandmother sent me to buy a pack of Marlboros. I ran the whole way, past the dying elms, wary of dogs and Protestants, until I reached the store. When I came back, out of breath and full of shame, she took the pack and told me to keep the change. A match flared and a sulphurous cloud rose above her head. I kept myself busy with a made-up game of chance as she smoked and drifted off. I flipped a coin to see if I should warn her as I watched the long ash grow toward her fingers as she slept. This is a poem set in a location that probably those of you in the audience have visited at one time or another, if you're local. It's called Watkins Glen, 1973. Stranded between love and punk, we drove to Watkins Glen to walk the trails and drop a hit of orange sunshine or a cap of white mescaline, or both. I stood behind a waterfall and stared at the froth where water poured into water and felt myself leave my body, become the water, move without moving like a seal made of light, as my exhilaration quickly turned to terror when my ego kicked in and said, "No, you're a separate thing." There's a photograph of the moment just before. I'm staring straight ahead. The water looks like a solid sheet of sunlight and smoke. My face so serene and radiant, it doesn't look like mine, but more like a Botticelli angel's, which is very strange to think about myself. But youth and whatever chemicals were active in my brain gave me a softness I've never had since. That same year, in winter, we went back and walked the trails, though the park was closed, the trails coated with ice. I was cold and felt the impermanence of being human as I watched the water, a dark gray snake I hoped wouldn't swallow me, but was glad to have a body, flawed, impermanent, and briefly luminous. I should mention that that photograph that I mentioned of that moment was used by the Syracuse YMCA for a couple of years as an advertisement for the kinds of activities that you could have uh, with the Y. This is called Chinese Umbrella. I lived in San Francisco for a short time in 1978, and during the time that I was there was quite eventful. The Jonestown Massacre, which included people from that congressional district, um, occurred, and the assassinations of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk took place. And this was written shortly after that, actually. This is an quite old poem, actually, revised considerably. Chinese Umbrella, San Francisco, 1978, after the assassinations of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk. It was getting dark. The autumn rain had been falling for hours. Storefront windows were a haze of blue light. Streets gleamed occasionally like dying filaments. Cold air drifted in from the bay. In Chinatown, jars of milky gray squids, fetal and liquid, had eyes that examined me as I began to recognize them as my own, my reflection on the glass creating a new beast. Green finches beat their tiny wings against the wooden bars of their frail bamboo cages. Smoke coiled like snakes from sticks of incense. White ash fell. Birds shrieked. I noticed a red and black umbrella suspended from the ceiling by a braided length of twine, like a flower hung to dry. On it there were gold markings, painted to resemble fish swimming through reeds. As the umbrella spun slowly around, I watched as the fish moved like thoughts that can't rise to the surface of the mind that has them. I couldn't hear the rain or the customers inquiring about the prices. My mind was as calm as the imaginary pond. Then I saw the twine that held the handle was frayed. I stepped quickly away as a sudden effusion of light cut through the violet clouds. When I opened the door to leave, the sound of the bell awakened me to a world of slain kings. The rain-soaked streets smelled of tar and sadness as everyone I looked at looked away. I'm going to read, this is the title poem. This be the last one from this section. The strange God who makes us. Something in the mother's shrunken sea urchin face as she guided her husband's wheelchair along morning rush hour traffic said their lives were worth living. A steadiness in the gaze, as if a distant sea roared from beyond the dull, uneven pavement, an ocean where they could simply merge with whatever world could maintain them better than this one with its seedy laundromats and discount groceries. The satisfied look on the boy's ash-colored face as he rode his father's narrow lap was as hopeful as the way he tipped his extended arms, first right, then left, in imitation of the plane that moved slowly across the impenetrable sky. Sun gleamed off the diamond patterns of the silver footrests, and one stray wheel, the left front, kept circling inward, pulling the chair toward the curb, the clacking of the wheel like the snapping of small bones. The stricken father had hands limp as two dead gulls that threatened to catch in the rusty spokes but never did. His face honed down to a neoclassical expression, angular, extreme, polished, and hardened like red marble. Mythical, as the Greeks might have looked when they imagined tragedy. This next section is poems with the same title, with each with subtitles, and all the poems are about my mother. They're about the time when she was in a nursing home with Alzheimer's, and basically I was just more or less keeping a journal, writing down what happened each time I visited her, and turned those into poems, turned them into sonnets, and then I revised those into prose poems because I thought they needed to be more narrative, and they really read like a sequence now, and they make up the whole second section. So I'll read a couple of from here, and then I'll read a couple from the third section, and I'll be finished. Memory unit, pregnancy scare. On the way to the hospital, my 92-year-old mother tells me she can't be pregnant. I've never even dated, she says. I don't know what to say. I explain that she's deficient, vitamin B, precautionary measures. But when I check her in, the woman at the desk says she'll need to go to the 5th floor, the psych ward, where she spent a few weeks, a few months before. The doctor asks her to disrobe, and she tells him she's not pregnant. He seems impatient, unwilling to humor her. I tell her it's all right. No one thinks you're pregnant. The doctor composes himself. He's red-faced, on the verge of anger. A nurse appears with a hospital gown, tells my mother to put it on. Why, my mother asks, near tears. I take the gown from the nurse and set it down on the metal table next to where my mother sits. She'll be fine, I say. The nurse seems about to speak, then thinks better of it. She looks at the doctor. They leave the two of us alone. Now what? My mother asks. I don't know, I say. She says, the least you could do is ask me to dance. Memory unit, broken record. My mother insists she's half here and half not here. I feel like an empty dress, she says. I feel like a wig, but no head. She thinks I'm her brother, home from World War II. I wonder if she's met my father yet, or if she's still at home, fighting with her sisters over their one good dress. Or is she further back, on Tompkins, looting the shelves of her grandfather's grocery store in the days of prosperity before the crash? Where do I live, she asks. What am I supposed to do? Nothing. I tell her she's supposed to do nothing. It's all taken care of, I say. And she looks around the room for her purse as she stuffs tissue after tissue into the pockets of her robe. I feel like an old shoe, she says. I feel like a broken record. She pats her white hair and says she needs to have it done. I can't go out looking like this, she says. She says, I feel like I can't remember. She tells me all her children are dead and asks me again who I am. I tell her I'm her youngest. She smiles and says, you wouldn't kid me, would you? I say, no, I wouldn't. I don't. I think I'll just read one more from this section. Memory unit, your face looks familiar. If you didn't come here, I wouldn't know a thing. I never heard of this before. At least I'm talking about it now. Tell me your name again. You're here to help me, right? I used to be Catholic, but not anymore. I'm dead. This is hell. There's nothing on TV anymore. The woman next to me never says a word. What am I supposed to do? Tell me your name again. Your face looks familiar. Do you think we can die? I know I can't go to heaven. Did you bring these pictures? I don't know what I'd do if you hadn't come here. It's awful to be alone. I don't have a memory. I'm 92. How old are you? You're young. I wish I knew what to do. Who's this again? My son? I remember red hair. I remember my wedding day and my husband, my brother Bill. What did he do? Is he dead? It doesn't bother me. Tell me again who you are. You look so familiar. I remember the face, but I've never seen you before. And I'll read two more poems. I'll read one from the very beginning of the third section. It's called The Perfect Syntax of Rain. Just for some context, a lot of the poems in this section are about climate change and just about the sort of the sort of impermanence of things and the reality of how much we don't have control over things, maybe, and also to some degree also memory, in the sense that um, you know, I know myself, I tend to be looking back at times when the idea of climate change maybe would have been a far off sci-fi kind of thing. So anyway, this poem sort of addresses that, I guess. The perfect syntax of rain. My house is a nest for every flying thing, and summer won't go away as it should, as it spreads its own dry and yellow wings across the sky. It could be the night has forgotten all of us, our memories erased, and no one knows what the stars are trying to say, all tricked out with light, or that the sky should be slick with rain as the wind carries away the leaves. But the wind carries nothing. The air is still and eerily warm, as if it too has forgotten to be itself, the way a painting can't remember paint. It's still good to be alive, and when the perfect syntax of rain finally arrives and reminds me of the womb, then my dreams will manifest a bright green lizard in the sink. Tonight, the sweetness of apples is a constant memory. Dirt in the folds of my skin when I bend my wrists. The moon is saying something to the sun, maybe a request for more light. The moon is huge and it doesn't matter. Its light is borrowed and has no power. I desire a river or a storm, a different way to remember the past. I was strangely happy then, when I used to listen to the creek rush by at night and feel what it's like to know exactly what to do. Grateful for my moonshot of a life, I sang with many tongues from my throat of unspeakable dark. And I'll read one last one. This is called Spring Cleaning. I raised the blinds to greet the dead flies, struck again this year by the luminous green surfaces of their metallic bodies. Or, as Roy Orbison used to sing, only the lonely know the way I feel tonight. As I carry away each desiccated husk, I think of my friends and my parents who never had wings, reduced now to memory, fading as the last light fades each night. The neighbors' Christ flowers bloom early this year, their purple blossoms stark against the ice-covered hills of snow that surround them. After gathering the flies together, I remember that sometimes flies are dormant, not dead, a concept I've never understood, and there's no way to know which state they're in. Buoyed by the thought of a possible resurrection, I pile the flies on the desk and wait.
Great to hear you read, Chris. To see your voice, see your face, and hear the poems. And I was telling somebody today when we were sort of getting ready to chat, I was thinking about it, how far back you and I go.
Yeah.
Which this is my 20th year at BOA, and we predate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's amazing to me now to be sitting here holding a copy of your fifth BOA book, including your the translation that you did, Light and Heavy Things, selected poem of Zeeshan Sahil. And one thing that occurred to me, I think all your books have elements of the personal, the autobiographical, but this one feels much deeper with that, and in some ways more vulnerable, more sort of open in that way. Does that sound accurate to you? Is that your take on this as well? And if so, can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah. I'm really terrified to have this book out there in the world because of that, in a way. A lot. I don't know how conscious it was, but there's definitely a lot less artifice. I think things go straight to the subject more so and I think that's an evolution in a way, and in a weird way, it also goes back. Some of the poems are old poems, and when I first started writing seriously, especially like when I was in graduate school, I wrote maybe 3 or 4 of the poems that are in here. In fact, the title poem was the title of my thesis in graduate school, so that'll give you an idea how old that poem is. But then I went back and revisited them when I was, many years later, obviously. And I realized that there was a kinship between what I was writing now and those poems, where I was really trying to write, you know, more straightforwardly, autobiographically about things that were hard for me to write about. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm ready. Maybe I'm ready to do that. Drop the mask a little bit. And then the whole book sort of ended up being that. A lot about memory, which I wasn't intending, but I think maybe because of watching my mother lose her memory, I started to realize how valuable the that we can just go into that vault and recall things that have happened in our past in a lucid way. And however distorted they may be, because memory is imperfect, but just to have access, to have it, to understand your identity, um, connecting to your origin story, like where you come from, and being able to place events where they actually occurred. And my mother was so all over the place with that sort of thing. And sometimes in a way that was upsetting to her, and sometimes in a way that was very liberating for her, which is one of the things I hope to get at with that section, is that it wasn't all, I mean, it was difficult, but there was her sense of humor was intact. She was extremely still really intelligent and capable, regardless of the fact that she was dealing with what she was dealing with.
Yeah, and obviously, memory unit creates, a really important section of the book, and it's almost like a spine of the book, when I think of it that way. So I'm curious, if was the book sort of built around those memory unit poems, or did you have the other poems and then realize that the memory unit ones can fit in with the others? How was that as far as the construction of the book?
I think the latter. I think what happened was when I was putting the manuscript together, I remembered that I had those poems, and those poems I had never intended to publish. I never sent them to journals or magazines or anything. They were very private. And then I went and looked at them, and I went, there's actually like a storyline here. This is very much beginning, middle, and end section that seemed like you're saying, sort of like a spine for the book. And I just thought, okay, just suck it up and put them in there, and don't worry about it. Like, don't think too much about it. And then, which is what I did. And then basically I sent it off to you, and I thought, like, I'm just not going to think about that. And then when I had some distance and I read through the manuscript as I was doing the editing process along with you and with Justine or whatever, I just thought, yeah, I mean, this makes perfect sense. And I was really glad that I had made that decision.
Well, I remember having lunch with you, and this now it probably would have been, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Mhm.
And you talking that you were working on pieces related to your mother. And I feel like I don't think they were poems at that point. I feel like you were maybe working in more of a straightforward sort of memoir form. Is that correct? And
Well,
did these morph
yeah,
from that, or is that?
initially they were poems. Initially they were double sonnets. They were like a sonnet that 14 lines. The last line would then be repeated as the first line of the next sonnet, but they were, a single unit. Um, but when I went back to them, I put them all into prose. I just thought there's something about these need to be prose poems, or maybe even, like you're saying, maybe even memoir, which I'd never really considered before. But it was just something about, like, it was such a strange experience in a lot of ways that there was no point in trying to embellish anything. It was really more like reporting on something. And so I thought prose seems like the most efficient and also most accessible way to write about it. Because the weirdness came from the conversations and just what my mother was saying to me and how I was trying to figure out how to react, and not knowing who I was supposed to be on a particular day. I mean, I didn't read this poem, but she thought I was her brother for quite some time, and so I would have to act. I mean, I just would assume a persona, and I just thought, why would I need to add anything to that? Like, it was just it was they were writing themselves in a way, and so yeah, I just tried to get out of the way as much as possible, basically.
And I think, I very much consider you a prose poet. And of course, I say that with a great deal of pride and affection and everything. And so it's, it was striking to me. I think a lot of times people think of prose poetry as being sort of surreal, or, it's like too out there to actually be able to deal with autobiographical material, right? It's a form to get wacky, and, like our friend would talk about monkeys doing all sorts of things and so forth.
Yeah.
But it actually, I mean, instead of me making a statement, why is prose poetry something that can be used to write autobiographical poems?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same sense of what prose poems could or couldn't do. But one of the things that I did when I was, maybe this was, I don't know how conscious this was, but I was actually, I was getting ready to teach a class on prose poetry and flash fiction. And I went back and read a lot of prose poems by as many different writers as I could find. And what I found were things like poems by James Wright and poems by Robert Bly, and people who were not writing surreal poems and would not have written surreal poems. And I thought, wow, especially the James Wright poems, because they're completely autobiographical and they're very straightforward and they're really wonderful poems. And I thought, maybe, and like I said, if the subject matter is already sort of heightened, there's really no need to try to push that toward something that's less realistic. When what is real is already so absurd and strange or even comic in some ways. So I just thought, all right, like anything else, you get permission, and then you're like, okay, now I could kind of not feel so self-conscious about this.
You have one of my favorite stories about how you actually got into writing prose poetry, connected to your experience with the Yale Younger Poets Prize. And I've retold this story in different occasions, and I hope I've done it justice, because there's something about it that I think it's just so clear and wonderful. And could you quickly maybe share the story that I'm talking about?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, I had a manuscript that was essentially a revision of my thesis from graduate school. And actually, some of the poems in this book were in that manuscript, right? And I sent it to the Yale Younger Poets Contest 4 years in a row. And the first 2 years I was a semifinalist, and the next 2 years I was a finalist. And the last year was literally my last year. I was no longer a younger poet, right? So I couldn't resubmit. And I got a letter. I went to this is pre-internet, pre-email. So I, went to the mailbox and opened the mailbox, and there were two envelopes in there. One was from Yale University Press, and the other had the return address of James Dickey, who was the judge for the contest. And I thought, well, maybe. And I opened the James Dickey letter, and it's basically him saying to me, without saying it right out, but basically saying to me, you resubmit next year, because I really liked it. He wanted me to send a copy of the manuscript to him, because he had to return the one that he had. He was just praising the book and telling me to keep writing for Yale and for him and for poetry. And I was like, I can't send it. I can't send it next year. So I wrote him, and I sent him the manuscript, and I wrote him a letter and said, hey, if you know anybody who wants to publish a book, and unfortunately he passed away not long after that. And so that connection never panned out. But I just said to myself, that's it. I'm never doing anything with this manuscript. I'm done. I'm completely done. And I completely shifted how I was writing, and I started writing what ended up being the prose poems in my first book, Nietzsche's Horse. And it was almost as if I was saying to myself, I have to break from this cursed thing, but interestingly enough, I mean, obviously, writing prose poems became something that I was really excited about, and I gotten really good feedback from. But I kept those other poems. I mean, I knew on some level that they were still, good poems. I just couldn't look at them anymore. And then eventually I was able to, and I started working on it. I turned them into prose poems, because I had an idea of how to write a prose poem. And then those poems, the ones that I salvaged from the manuscript, I thought lent themselves to that. So that's what I ended up doing. And that, yeah, so I basically got maybe 3 different books out of that manuscript. So I was probably better off not winning the Yale Prize.
And you
Oh,
still, I mean, it's clear to me, and just listening to you, that you still sort of work in that way sometimes of, having something lineated, turning it
yeah,
into prose, maybe back again.
I
It
always do.
seems, yeah, I mean, I wonder if you hadn't started with lineated poems, if you had just jumped into writing prose poems, you probably wouldn't have that as a compositional technique, tactic.
Yeah, I don't. I actually just wrote an essay that's going to be in the Adroit Journal. I think it's going to be on their online site about that because there was a couple of different influences, but one I had when I was in graduate school, one of my cohort was a poet Jane Mead, who was a wonderful poet. Um, and Jane was severely dyslexic. And I remember her telling me one time that everything she wrote in prose before she turned it into verse because it was easier for her to do that because of the dyslexia. And I just thought that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. Like, like to me, they're two very different things. And that was always in the back of my head. And then when I started reading prose poems and really getting into prose poems, I thought when I finally decided to try to write my own, I thought, I'm gonna see what happens if I do what Jane did, and I would write the prose version, put it into verse, and I would just go back and forth. And that's really become my process, where I start with prose, put it into verse, because I figure if I can get it to work well in verse, and then when I bring it back into prose, that the sentences are going to be stronger, and vice versa. When I get the sentences tighter, when I put it back into verse, the verse version is better. And then eventually once I get it to a prose version that I'm happy with, then I know I'm done with that.
As somebody who's taught creative writing for quite a long time now at Syracuse University, and Chris is a professor of English in the MFA program in creative writing at Syracuse University, I'm curious what your experience has been of introducing students to prose poems. And I mean, I get the sense of it being very liberating for you. Do you think that students that you've worked with find the form liberating to them, or is it a little, maybe sometimes it backfires and goes the opposite way and seems like too much?
The last few semesters, it's been very positive, I'd say. And I'd say even before that, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 that I can think of offhand, former students of mine who were not writing prose poems, but then started writing prose poems and have published really good collections of prose. And in fact, one of them just published last year, published a collection of essays that I don't know that she would have written had she not been writing prose poems, and it was a really good collection of essays. And so, yeah, and then just recently, I just taught an undergraduate class. I haven't taught undergraduates in like 10 years. And I taught a prose poetry flash fiction class, which was a variation on the grad course that I teach. And I was amazed. And I also taught a workshop, advanced poetry workshop. And a lot of the students were writing prose poems in both of those classes, with the option of writing whatever they really wanted to write, but they really gravitated toward the form. And it's really good writers in both of those classes.
And of course, I have to mention, and I sort of alluded to our friend who liked to write about monkeys, but you have a poem in the collection called At the Supermarket with
Yeah,
Russell Edson.
yeah.
And so, I'm sure there's people who are unfamiliar, with his work or with his name and so forth. So can you talk just a little bit about your connection to his work and influences that he might have had on your writing? And then in addition to that, and you've mentioned a couple names, but other influences that you might like to just shout out to us while we're talking about it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Russell Edson's were the first prose poems that I read, and they were in an anthology that I used to work in the audiovisual department at Onondaga Community College, and it was the AV department was in the library, and I worked nights and on Saturdays. So when the library closed, I would go into the stacks and I would pull out, this was before I was really writing seriously, Actually, in fact, you'll appreciate this. It was that, and then there was a media center, and I used to go in there, and I found these Betamax tapes of this guy named Al Poulin Jr. who was interviewing poets, and I was like, I wonder what this is, and so I saw him interviewing Ginsberg and Denise Levertov and Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, all of that, sort of beat and beat centric uh, crew, and those interviews were fantastic. And so between that and then I pulling the anthology, but there wasn't one particular anthology. I saw these poems, and they were prose, and they were really weird. And I thought, what is this? And I kept going back to them. I was just so like enamored of what he was doing. They were so off the wall. They were so different from everything else in the anthology that I kind of got obsessed with that. And then I found collections of his and started reading them. And that's really what got me thinking that maybe I could do that, because it felt like he was having so much fun with the form, but he was also getting at really serious things underlying those sort of comic surfaces. And I thought I thought that was perfect in a way. You can write about things that are profound, but with this facade that makes you think you're just kind of being entertained. I really love that about his work. Um, Zbigniew Herbert, who's a Polish poet, he has prose poems that were also really influential. When I was in graduate school, I had a teacher who gave us a list of poets that we should read if we want to be serious poets, and a lot of Eastern European poets, and Herbert and Czesław Miłosz is another one, and I read them, but I really gravitated to the Herbert, and then James Wright, who I loved, and I didn't know he wrote prose poems until he had a collection called This Journey, I think. It might have been his last collection, and there were prose poems in there that I really liked a lot. But the clincher for me was going down to the Rome Fine Arts Center and to a reading Charles Simic gave, and he was reading from The World Doesn't End. I didn't know they were prose poems, and he had just won the Pulitzer Prize, actually, if I remember correctly, and I loved those poems. And then it was only after, when I went up and I bought the book and I, gave it to him to sign, and he opened it. I was like, oh my God, prose poems, there they are again. So that was kind of the clincher. Like, okay, he really made me feel like, okay, this is really something you can do and people will respect it. Because when I would mention to people that I was, writing prose poems, didn't get a favorable response at that time. I remember telling Hayden Carruth, who was a mentor of mine, that I was writing prose poems, and he turned to me and he goes, "Why the hell would you want to do that?" So come a long way. The genre has come a long way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing because I think of that Pulitzer Prize, and then also when Peter Johnson won the James Laughlin
Yeah,
Award for his collection of prose
yeah,
poetry. And it's like, we don't have a lot to point to as far as awards for just
right.
prose poetry collections, but
Yeah,
there was something like, okay, well, if that's possible, and I
yeah,
think in a similar way, I think of poets like Gary Young, and
mhm,
what he did with prose
yeah,
poetry as opposed to somebody like Edson, or what Peter Johnson, continues to do, and so forth.
yeah,
There is a huge range, actually, and I think, again, somebody like Gary Young, who was sort of working from this Robert Bly lineage, going towards somebody like Edson, that's a huge amount of space. And I think in any form like that, we need the people who are working on those margins so that we can sort of find where the edges are, and move in, or decide to move out even farther.
yeah.
Um,
And Peter's been very supportive of me. I didn't like when he was editing the journal that he had. I didn't even have the audacity to send poems to him. And I remember him saying to me, "Why didn't you ever send me poems?" And I just didn't think he'd publish them. And he's been great. He's been really supportive, and yeah, and he's obviously a really good prose poet. And people like Nin Andrews and Michael Benedict. There's, I mean, when you were doing when you and Mark were doing the journal, you were publishing really good people consistently. So, Double Room was another thing that was a really great resource for finding prose poets.
Yeah, well, and it's funny. Thank you for that. And it's funny because that really came out of the dissolution of Prose Poem International, which
Oh,
was
okay.
Peter Johnson's
Yeah,
journal, which he, ran and published exclusively prose poems for years when you weren't finding prose poems in literary journals. So there had to be sort
yeah,
of this unique place for it.
yeah,
And when that folded up, Michael Neff from Web del Sol approached me and asked if I
mm,
would like to restart that as an online journal. Of course, I'm sure, having never spoken to Peter Johnson about the concept, so we turned
sure,
it down,
yeah,
but we ended up starting Double Room.
yeah,
And that's where you and I connected, I believe, when
yeah, yeah.
around prose poetry first.
Yeah, and Mark wrote a review of my first book too, and And actually, and we were, yeah, I think that wasn't, I just remember you invited me, you were doing that reading series
Yeah.
at the museum, and I remember came up and I read for that. And I think
Oh,
that's the first time we actually met in person.
that's right. And we were supposed to be pressmates at Mitki Press.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
Right?
Yeah, which didn't last long enough for that to happen.
But Sean Thomas Dougherty got a book out with them, and Charles Rafferty
Charles
too, another
Rafferty,
fine prose poet.
considering how short-lived, they actually really did a great job. And actually, one of the people who started Mitki started the press that did my second book. So
Ah,
that was my lifeline for a while. And they were both SU MFA program grads.
well, and I should probably sort of out and mention too that Russell Edson, Christopher Kennedy, Sean Thomas Dougherty, and Charles Rafferty are now all BOA poets as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, it's
So
amazing to me that we're all in the same boat.
yeah. Well, Chris, we could talk forever about this. We have
Yeah.
before, and we will again. But it was so great having you here and giving everybody else a chance to hear you talk about these things and to read some of your poems. So I hope people will check out The Strange God Who Makes Us, and perhaps you could leave us with one more poem. I'm going to sign off, but thank you so much for being here tonight.
Okay, thank you, Peter. You know what? I was going to read the last poem in the book, but I think what I'll do is I'm going to read the poem that Peter mentioned at the supermarket with Russell Edson, which is the last poem in the first section. And thank you to those of you who showed up, and I appreciate it. And I'm going to end with this. At the supermarket with Russell Edson. How often I think of you, Russell Edson, as I browse the meat aisle and scavenge the packaged limbs for Gorilla Fist to gnaw on for dinner. Half crazed by fluorescence, I remember when you asked the hotel clerk for 200 keys. Her face was the face of all of America, confused, rattled, a little stupid with expectations far from the world as it is. I still fell in love with her. Something about her smile said more than biannual trips to the dentist for cleanings. Once I'm done shopping, I plan to drive straight to the hotel to propose to her, or whoever works the 3 to 11 shift these days. I imagine you, Russell, one of 12 children, a cartoon life in Darien, pushing a cart through the IGA while Muzak castrated a popular tune of the era as you followed the scuff marks of those who shopped before you, devising your escape through a logic only you could imagine. But what's this? No gorilla fists? The world's not the same without you, Russell. A man can't cook his favorite stew these days. I'm surrounded by chicken and pork and beef, not even a pig's knuckle to hold me over until the primates are back in fashion. When I check out, I'll do it myself and leave inconspicuously, my head full of dreams and thoughts with a wife I don't have, berating me for forgetting something I didn't know I needed. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Christopher, for such a wonderful reading. And thanks, Peter, if you're still here for that great conversation. And yeah, thank you to everyone here for joining us tonight. If you're interested in pre-ordering Christopher's book, I've linked that in the chat. Yeah, have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.